que el mundo va a cambiar, nos dicen, que cuando votemos nos escucharán. Si en cambio no votáis, nos dicen, los del otro lado nos aplastarán y así se quedarán, nos dicen, con las manos libres para hacer su plan.
This is a podcast special from the Final Straw Radio. We had a chance to meet up with an Anglophone anarchist living in Catalonia who's lived there for a number of years to talk about the recent political sticky wicket concerning Catalan Referendum for independence from the Spanish state. So we talk about the history of Catalonia, its relationship with Spain, past efforts at independence, radical politics, and anarchist approaches around national liberation struggles and cultural heritage struggles, and a bunch more. So I hope you enjoy this, and here we go. Anarchists have been pretty decided on the question of nationalism, in that we oppose borders and the state. However, this viewpoint is often complicated by arguments seeking further autonomy, respect for cultural heterogeneity, and integrity of languages within the internal and external colonies of the world's nation-states. Right now, the world is seeing a crisis unfold within the crisis that is the Spanish state, in terms of a national referendum in the northern province of Catalunya. To help shed some light on this scenario, we're joined by an Anglophone anarchist who's been living in Catalunya for quite some time. Thank you very much for taking the time to join and have this conversation.
Thanks so much for organizing this and getting this out there.
Yeah, and fuck Google, right?
Absolutely. One quick note, if you want to go back there later, or I'm not sure, Catalonia is technically 3 different provinces.
Oh.
So like the official way to refer to it is a region or an autonomous community.
Okay, that's great. I think I'm just going to leave your correction in there.
Okay.
So what can you tell us about Catalexit? I'm just kidding. I just made up that term. I wanted to see if it'd get any traction at all.
At the moment, it's a pretty hairy situation because the Catalan government and the overarching Spanish state are on a pretty serious collision course, and it remains to be seen what will happen. But I guess the motivations for Catalan independence movement go back a good deal of time. So that to it that has been taking on a specific form, especially since 2002, which is now manifested in a referendum vote that's to take place this Sunday, the 1st of October. The Spanish state has declared that referendum vote to be illegal, whereas the Catalan government, which according to the Spanish constitution is semi-autonomous but subordinate to the Spanish government, the Catalan government has decided to go ahead with the referendum vote anyways.
Would it be sufficient to call the Spanish government Madrid? Would that be like a shorthand that might be easier?
Absolutely, yeah. The central Spanish government, their and the presidential palace and all the rest are located in Madrid, as well as the king, because they still have a king here. Actually, still is inappropriate. They got a king in the mid-70s with the end of the fascist dictatorship to try to provide a force of stability for the new democracy.
But Spain operates as a parliamentary democracy, yeah?
Parliamentary, monarchical democracy, yeah.
Are there other examples of autonomous regions within, or semi-autonomous regions within Spain that have like a similar governmental format?
Absolutely. According to the 1978 Constitution, which was agreed upon by the recently post-fascists and the left, constituted by socialists and communists, agreed to a constitution which gave some lip service to the independence aspirations of various of the peoples who were included in the Spanish state, so including the Catalans and the Basques. In general, the Spanish state, based on this 1978 constitution, is comprised of what are called autonomous communities or just cities, and each of them has sort of a different deal. They got slightly varying levels of autonomy, and so the Basque country, or Euskadi, has like a slightly different deal than Catalunya, which has a slightly different deal from Valencia, and so on and so forth. It's worth mentioning that what are historically referred to as the Catalan countries, els països catalans, like countries where Catalan was historically the dominant language going back, are actually divided into 3 different communities under the Spanish state, which would be Catalunya, Valencia, and the Balearic Isles, as well as also a part in France which was separated from the rest back about 300 years ago.
Also, can you talk about Catalan as a language, like where it derives from? Is it a derivative of Spanish?
No, it's not a derivative of Spanish. Catalan, like French and Italian, are derivatives of Vulgar Latin, whereas Spanish is a derivative of Classical Latin. So even to find the common roots, you'd have to go back more than 2,000 years. Spanish also has a lot more Arabic influence, whereas Catalan has a lot more French influence. So they're languages that are definitely of the same family, but the linguistic space, you could say, between Catalan and Spanish is about equal to or even greater than the linguistic space between Spanish and Italian, for example.
What is the basis of argument for independence that the Catalan separatists are making?
Well, Catalonia was included in the Spanish polity in an act of conquest in the early 1700s. Various times there have been rebellions against Spanish political domination or for greater levels of independence. Of course, have happened in Catalan-speaking lands, and the strongest ones have been lower class rebellions against liberal modernization, against capitalism. For example, everyone's really familiar with the Partial Revolution in July 1936. Nonetheless, pretty much all those movements also had some element of national or popular identity. So it's complicated. On the other hand, of course, there's also without a doubt, a bourgeois movement that seeks to create Catalunya as a nation state. You can see that the state has had only a limited presence in Catalunya's cultural linguistic history. It's definitely had a presence, but Catalan, for example, is a much more diverse, heterogeneous language than Spanish or English, because for most of the history of that language, there hasn't been a sovereign Catalan state. And as hopefully everyone knows, states have the effect of homogenizing cultures among their subject population, so they sort of flatten out any differences. The difference in how Catalan is spoken, if you go just 50 kilometers, is pretty huge. So that's a reflection that, for the most part, Catalunya hasn't been a state-formed entity. The way, for example, French people, German people, the English Americans, these are all state products. These are artificial creations that are basically meant to sort of serve state interests of interclassist unity and cultural homogeneity. That hasn't fully been the case in Catalunya. So there is a Catalan bourgeoisie that's definitely interested in creating that homogenized interclassist nation state, but that's certainly not the entire picture. They're the ones who are definitely in charge of the current referendum movement. The movement as it exists now started in 2012. Before that, the independence movement was overwhelmingly a left-wing phenomenon. Large parts of the independence movement identified as anti-capitalist. But in 2012, the ruling party was a Catalan right-wing, typical neoliberal party that was suffering from dwindling support, suffering from corruption cases in the media. They all of a sudden put their support behind the idea of Catalan independence. September 11th is sort of the Catalan national holiday. That's the day that Barcelona was conquered by Spanish troops in the early 1700s. So there's a huge protest every year, and that year this party, CiU, announced support for Catalan independence, but under the slogan of Catalunya, State of Europe. So from the very beginning, they were linking the Catalan independence movement to sort of modernization, to membership in the European Union. Prior to that, the Catalan independence movement, which I mentioned was left-wing, was very critical of or against the European Union. And so this new movement that was very top-down, it started passing off this propaganda about how Catalonia is a richer region, and the relationship with Spain is exploitative because more tax money goes into Spain than comes back. And if Catalonia were independent, then it could be a more modern, more progressive state like one of these Northern European Scandinavian states. So theirs was a very statist message, but because of their superior resources, they were really able to hijack the independence movement. And since then, it's been focused on winning independence through institutional means, through a referendum. But it has to be said that the left wing has entirely played along with that. They, for their part, have constituted like sort of one of these grassroots political parties, which is made from cobbling together different activist organizations and grassroots organizations, and they've gone into parliamentary politics to play the sort of the role of sort of like the radical junior partner in the coalition. And they've been making stands on symbolic issues, but all of their supposedly anti-capitalist platform has gone out the window. But what they bring to the table is a very large network of activists who've been real mobilizations and putting up all the posters and propaganda.
What does that say about the lack of traction and ability of these left organizations to be able to constitute themselves from a powerful position within the debate? Like what are they missing, or how is propagandistic like kung fu being enacted against them? Like why can't they actually argue for what they were wanting before? Is it that like to argue against the EU membership or to argue against constituting themselves as a state would be viewed as reactionary in the way of like a Brexit sort of thing? Or break it down.
They're addicted to power. That's all there is to it. They're just addicted to power. There's no shortage of historical arguments that show pretty much exactly what's going to, or if not exactly what's going to happen, what are the range of possible options, none of which match up with their supposed anti-capitalist desires or pretensions. But yeah, once they get elected and they have people who are making money as professional politicians, they're institutionally linked in, and there's no way out for that. So there's not really much use of rational argument. The sort of the popular unity model that this most left-wing party, the CUP, is using. I mean, that's been deployed before historically, and again has proven incapable of rupturing with capitalism. But yeah, they're just I think afraid of conceiving actual radical social transformation that goes all the way to the very roots. I mean, they use radical rhetoric, like everything, but they talk about changing everything by using the existing political structures and not even changing the political structures. So it's one part superficiality, one part fear of envisioning a radical change and how difficult that would be to actually achieve. And then as soon as they traditional path, then they become more and more hierarchical, and their leaders owe their leadership to this access to institutional power.
So I'd like to return to some of the underlying ideas behind the referendum and problems of nationalism in a moment. But so with the referendum set for this Sunday, declared illegal by the central Spanish government out of Madrid, what sort of state reaction have you seen coming from the central government in Madrid against the Catalan government and the activists pushing for the referendum?
Yeah, it's actually been getting pretty intense. It's since 2012, it's been dragging on for a while. They had a non-binding consulta, would that be in English, like a consultation, like a non-binding referendum, basically. Mm-hmm. Then they had another, in which the independence option won. Then they had another election, which they said would serve as another referendum because the political parties, which were openly in favor of independence, won a majority. And now this time they finally decided that they're going to cross the point of no return and go with a binding referendum, which if the results were yes for independence, they would establish in the days immediately after the referendum. And then at the beginning, I guess it was the beginning of September, the Catalan Generalitat, the parliament, passed an express law saying that within 48 hours of the referendum, they would produce the institutional rupture and unilaterally break with Spain and constitute Catalonia as a new state. As soon as that happened, and so there was before that a really big war of words, increasing polarization. One thing that's very important, the party that's in power now in Spain, in Madrid, not Madrid city, but the central Spanish government, is the PP, the Popular Party. That's the directly post-fascist political party. That's the party that all the old fascists formed when Spain was transitioning to democracy. So they are unable to use more conciliatory mechanisms. The smartest thing would have been, way back in 2012, 2013 for the government to say, oh, sure, you want to do a referendum, do one, and then just play it like Great Britain did with Scotland. Put on the propaganda about all of the economic disadvantages that independence would have, let the people vote, assure that with the media advantage, the no option would probably win, and even to be safe, the way that you phrase the referendum, you can make sure that like the yes option would be ambiguous, that it could lead to, for example, a constitutional reform and greater autonomy without full independence. If like England did with Scotland, then they would have been able to make this thing blow over at least for a while, or sap it of a lot of support. But because it's the post-fascist party in control, they to let Catalonia sort of brook the notion of independence. So they've been really heavy-handed, which of course has provoked more resistance and more sympathy for Catalan independence, even among Spanish speakers in Catalonia. So as soon as that law was passed by the Catalan parliament, saying how exactly they would make the referendum unilateral, blocked that law. They declared that law illegal. They cited numerous Catalan politicians. And then it's been ratcheting up even more. Catalonia has its own police force, the Mossos d'Esquadra. Then Spain has a military police force, La Guardia Civil. They've started sending that military police force, that Spanish police force, into different places in Catalonia to raid print shops where they suspect ballots are being printed, or where they suspect that posters and flyers in favor of the referendum or in favor of independence are being printed. And they've done a number of raids over the last week and a half, say, seized millions and millions of copies of ballots, of posters, of propaganda. And then just this past Wednesday, they took the step of arresting over a dozen politicians and functionaries. Instead of arresting the more charismatic, well-known politicians, the leaders of these different pro-independence political parties, what they've done is to arrest people at a sort of second tier, but that are very, very important with the logistics of the referendum. So people high up in the party, but people who aren't known on television, who are involved with the like the technological and the logistical aspects of making this referendum happen. When they carried out those arrests, you had a response, those raids and arrests, you had a response in Barcelona of tens of thousands of people swarming the streets. Of course, the different parties enforced a really strict practice of nonviolence. It seemed like actually this left-wing party, the CUP, was even the most disciplined in enforcing nonviolence, because of course they don't want to be seen as the irresponsible radicals ruining this spectacle. But with these tens of thousands of people, they surrounded the Guardia Civil, and the Spanish police got trapped in these different buildings that they were raiding. People swarmed the riot vans of the police and put stickers all over them, or in a few cases popped the tires. And so they needed rescuing. What happened shortly before this was the Mossos d'Esquadra got orders from the Spanish state to obey the order, to obey Madrid, and to stop doing anything to support the referendum. Prior to this, in August, I think it was, the Catalan government replaced the interior minister and the head of the police with people who would be more loyal to them and more supportive of the referendum. But the Spanish government basically got the Catalan police to declare that they would take action to stop the referendum. But then after that day, it was clear that they were being very wishy-washy about it. So they weren't really doing an effective job at clearing out the crowds and protecting the Spanish police. The Spanish police, by the way, the Guardia Civil, in general, they don't have riot police training. They're out there with machine guns. I mean, they certainly would be equipped and have a hell of a lot of experience clearing crowds, but not in a very media-friendly way, basically. During the transition in the 70s, they were responsible for killing a whole lot of striking workers, for example. So since then, the Spanish government appointed a figure to be the new head of the Mossos, of the Catalan police, trying to win direct control of the Catalan police. And at the moment, the Catalan police are actually resisting that and questioning whether or not that's legal. So they're kind of trying to sit in the middle. You've had big protests, which have just seen people of all ages, entire families going out in the streets and putting up posters everywhere in favor of independence. You really are having like a popular rebellion. And it's also worth noting that every single year on September 11th. The protests in favor of independence have been between 1 and 2 million people, and that's in a country, Catalunya, of 7.5 million. Then the other thing that's happened is they sent in, because they have limited barrack space for the Spanish police here in Catalunya, so they actually hired a couple cruise ships, and they have several thousand Guardia Civil in the port, camped out in these cruise ships in the Barcelona port. And now the Barcelona port have started taking action against the Spanish police on those ships. They've refused to service those ships, so the cops actually have to go out on foot to supermarkets to like buy their supplies. And then they've also started like blaring horns and making a lot of noise during the night, so that the cops can't sleep in the port. And those cops, on the other hand, are also like being vocal on Twitter, on Facebook, and so forth, talking about how happy they'll be to go out and kick some ass. There's one tweet or whatever that got retweeted a lot of Guardia Civil complaining about how bad conditions were on the boat, how they were really, really cramped. But on the good side, they had enough armament to destroy Beirut, were his words. So they're getting psyched about the possibility of being sent into action, which, given how they work, would probably mean lethal force. So what is it? Today's Monday. The referendum's supposed to be on Sunday. For the moment, the Spanish government is trying to make it logistically impossible by seizing all of the ballots, but people can also print out ballots online. They've tried closing down websites in favor of independence, and in favor of the referendum, but the Catalan government has set up new websites hosted in other countries. A lot of people have been encouraged to get software on their computers so that they can, so if the Spanish government turns off the internet in Catalunya, they'll reconnect themselves to the internet and keep communicating, similar to what happened in Egypt during the Arab Spring. And the European Union authorities have been pressuring the Spanish government to try to be more calm, to not do anything that would frighten off investment or tarnish the image of democracy. But the Spanish president has been promising to use whatever necessary to stop the referendum. People who have family members who are in the military have said that the military have been called up. Like there's not a lot of like active. I mean, generally they're not so active here. So the ones who basically be sort of like in reserves or in standby have been called up. I haven't seen that in the news. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they're keeping that quiet, because it means that it's not sheerly a publicity stunt or a way to pressure the Catalan government that they're maybe actually considering using them. So that in the next days they dissolve the Catalan parliament. They might arrest the leaders of the political parties for independence. They might go to as many of the different voting centers as they can, and arrest any of the volunteers who are working at the polls. Any of those options would definitely mean conflict in the streets, because millions of people would come out to oppose that, which of course raises a pretty difficult question of what do we do as anarchists in that situation when repression is primarily targeting other state figures.
That does raise the question, like where do anarchists in Catalonia, in your impression, sit in terms of this? I mean, in terms of the referendum, maybe that's pretty clear, but in terms of the competing forces between the like actual state existent and the would-be sovereign.
Yeah, I would say that the vast majority of anarchists in Catalunya have one thing clear, that if there's police being used, if there's repression in the streets, then we'll also be in the streets to fight back against that repression. That group, of course, can be divided into a lot of different camps or placed on a pretty broad continuum. Outside of that, there's others, and maybe in a more Venn diagram kind of overlapping sort of way, there's a lot of anarchists who are just really confused by the whole situation and having certainly feel motivated or perturbed by the situation in some way, but are having a hard time figuring out how to position themselves and what to do. And then I get the feeling a very, very small number of primarily Facebook warriors who are saying that it's simply a conflict between two states, or a conflict between Spanish bourgeoisie and Catalan bourgeoisie. I think that, I mean, there's certainly like anarchism. Anarchism is sort of like the radical extreme of liberalism, in which rights are purely an individual affair, and therefore questions like culture and language, since these are collective realities, these are realities that don't make sense on an individual scale, don't have any importance. And that strain of anarchism, in my mind, takes a fairly Eurocentric read of national liberation movements, only understanding them in a European or Western context, in which national liberation movements are always nationalists and always seek the creation of a new nation state. Whereas a vision that focuses more on cultural and linguistic self-determination would realize that nationalist movements also destroy that self-determination through that homogenizing force that I mentioned earlier. Such a view would also take into account various anti-colonial struggles that were not fighting for a new state, but that were fighting against the imposition of the state as a Western artifact. And you could also consider that, probably the four most revolutionary, multitudinary examples of anarchism in practice would be Catalunya 1936, the Machnovщина in 1919, the Balkans Commune in 1903, and the Shinmin Commune in Manchuria in 1929. Three out of four of those arose in part because anarchists took part in national anti-statist, anti-nationalist way. So there's certainly like a rich history there, and certainly a lot of room to maneuver that doesn't put us in the dead end of nationalism. So some anarchists are taking that viewpoint. Some anarchists are putting out criticisms of democracy and criticisms of political independence, but talking about what would look like if it existed on all levels of life. What would self-determination look like if it weren't just simply a ritual of one day for political self-determination, but once again applied to all levels and every moments of life. So trying to sort of push this thing farther, take advantage of a moment of rupture to try to push it farther. Other anarchists, unfortunately, have taken a more populist view, simply supporting it and also accepting democracy as this positive value, and contrasting like the Catalan process as democratic and the Spanish reaction as dictatorial. And certainly the Spanish state is using dictatorial means to stop this thing, but technically they're using dictatorial means in support of a democratic constitution. So any fair analysis of the situation shows that the law is a pretty cheap tool to justify what any particular side wants to justify, since both sides are technically breaking the law, but then claiming to do so in the name of the law. So there you have it. Going back to the anarchists, it's obviously there aren't really anarchists who care if politicians get arrested. A lot of us are laughing that those who sought to run the prisons have to see the inside of a prison cell. Of course, in a more truly anarchistic sense, we don't want to use prisons against anyone, so we're not actually supporting that politicians are getting sent to prison. It's just poetic justice, simply. But a lot of the repression is being directed against just regular people in the streets, people who are protesting, people who are putting up posters. And even if we don't agree with those people, we're definitely going to be there alongside them, fighting against the police or trying to stop it. And that's where this question of pacifism becomes really, really complicated. Who are committed to pacifism are basically committed to getting beat up. And if you go into the streets and try to stop the police from beating people up, well, if they're pacifists, then they'll be the first ones to get up, grab you, and try to hand you over to the cops. So, of course, not everyone has been perfectly pacifist, but it makes the situation more difficult and more dangerous for us. So that's another of the big questions.
Has that been a tendency? And I'm familiar with that being with a lot of considering the civil rights struggles of the 50s and 60s in the United States, and the Gandhi-esque approach of Martin Luther King, and who's held up as a huge symbol, and I would argue taken out of context in terms of his approaches towards violence and nonviolence by liberals in the United States, who have a basic faith in the functioning of democratic society as it is set up currently. Is that something similar to a pacifist approach in the Spanish context or in the Catalan context, or is it more of a Catholic thing, or from whence does it come?
Not at all. Nonviolence is a very weak tradition here. It's If you look at all of the really, really strong, really, really rich movements of the 20th century, there are only a couple that I could think of that had that included forms of nonviolence, a minoritarian phenomenon. Nonviolence on a massive scale arose spontaneously with the 15M or Indignados movement, and it lasted 9 months, at least in Catalonia. It lasted 9 months before people realized that it was an absurd idea, that it was completely ineffective, and so it took 9 months for people to go from extreme authoritarian nonviolence that brooked no dissent and no other possibilities for taking to the streets to a general strike that bordered on an open insurrection. And since then, people, for the most part, have remembered again that that pacifism is bullshit. Pacifism is very, very strong, and what's happening now is nothing less than a symbol of the control that political parties are exerting over this process. As long as this thing stays peaceful, that means that the political parties are in control, and that what's happening is being used by them to set themselves up in power to create a new authoritarian system, a state that will probably be even stronger than the Spanish state. And if things get out of control, if people actually start defending themselves and fighting back, then that will mean a real rupture is being produced, not just on an institutional level, but on a social level between society and the institutions that govern it. And that really remains to be seen. I kind of suspect, given how little the political parties who have been organizing this independence referendum have been talking about different forms of ending the referendum, even in nonviolent self-defense, I kind of suspect that they're actually planning to lose, that they want to get beaten up, they want to get repressed, and in so doing, to win a lot of legitimacy, to win a lot of credibility at the European Union level, to delegitimize the Spanish state, and to allow them to win future elections. So they might even be looking for a non-rupturist solution to this whole thing, which will make them look like martyrs without, obviously like dying or anything like that, just going to prison for a couple days, getting fines and getting beat up a little bit, so that they can portray their enemy as morally corrupt, and then force elections or force a referendum that Madrid consents to. Because right now the big left-wing party on the Spanish level, Podemos, is in favor. Actually, they've been like pretty disgusting and like slimy politicians about the whole thing. They're talking out of both sides of their mouth, supporting the right of self-determination, supporting the referendum, but also doing a bunch of tricks to try to slow it down or to decrease support for it, because they basically see the referendum and the Catalan independence struggle as a ticket to political power, because they're really the only ones with a solution from the Spanish point of view, which would be a constitutional reform that would create a plurinational state, but it would recognize Catalans as a people, give them some more rights, maybe give them a little bit more control of their budget, which of course would be of interest to Catalan business owners, since they would be the primary recipients of that reinvestment. And so they have this proposal, but they're in the opposition right now. They don't have the ability at the moment to launch that proposal as a law. So what is actually in their best interests is if this independence movement loses at the moment, but then the PP, the Popular Party, ends up looking really bad, loses the next elections, Podemos gets in, they get to rise to power and then offer the solution, which preserves the Spanish state, but then partially honors Catalan desires for very limited independence. So anyways, I'm going to talk about things getting polarized, which is definitely true, but there's also a lot more hands in the pot.
Kind of jumping around a little bit, there was a tweet that I saw recently from Enough is Enough, or at Enough14 on Twitter, that was showing ostensibly fascist phrases coming out of the Twitter account of the Guardia. Like you had talked about them being on their ship and being pissed off and tweeting about how they can't wait to jump off and kick ass once they get unleashed. When they were referring to themselves as La Tormenta in the tweets, even coming from their official Twitter account. Also, they have a frickin' fasces in their logo. But can you talk about the ideological positioning of the Guardia and counterpositioning that to the Mossos de Escuadra? Is the Mossos, like you said, they're on the fence right now, but ideologically as police, they're probably more likely to serve as Catalan nationalists, I would assume?
Let's see, the Guardia Civil are definitely a very post-fascist police force with pretty minimal posts. They were very active and important during the Franco regime. They weren't really changed in any way when Spain transitioned to a democracy, and they were really active in the repression of the Basque independence movement, which manifested largely as an armed struggle. And yeah, they're just they tend to be extremely right wing, extremely fascistic. It's both the institutional heritage and also the orientation of specific members. The Mossos de Escuadra are also cops. They've been growing a lot in the last few years. So they recruit the type of mercenary, sadistic elements that go to police forces anywhere. Since they're recruiting in Catalonia, that would be a mix of people who identify as Catalans and maybe even support independence, although they'd be more likely to be right-wingers. But then they'd also be recruiting a lot of these Spanish immigrants, who constitute a large part of the population of Catalonia, second and third, especially generation immigrants from southern Spain. And so a lot of them might be completely opposed to the idea of Catalan independence. However, the higher ranks are more likely to feel loyalty to the Catalan government. And as I mentioned, the head of the Mossos was replaced recently so that the police would be led by someone more loyal to the Catalan government and more favorable to the idea of independence. So you'll definitely have, within the Mossos, you'll have fascists of both stripes, Spanish and Catalan, and then also Democrats, but cops. So mercenaries, sadists, cowards, and the like. It's actually kind of weird. I mean, it makes sense, kind of analyzing like the structures and like how these different attitudes are produced, but it's just really weird inhabiting reality in which the politicians are being really technically brave, to be honest, whereas the cops are really moderate and going around on tiptoes and trying not to create more conflict or create more problems, because oftentimes in a lot of the revolts that, for example, we've seen in the US or Greece, France, the UK, and so forth, the politicians are kind of always trying to clean up the messes that heavy-handed cops are creating when they're killing people of color and so forth.
What sort of relationship exists between them and the police? And like we've seen in other places, there being a distinctive ideological difference between people who are in the military and people who are in the policing forces. Like in Egypt, for instance, like one would be called to protect, the military was called in at one point or was at least welcomed by elements within the general population as repression by the police was increasing. Is there a sort of difference that might be seen, do you think, politically between calling in the military versus having the Guardia descend upon the population? I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but I'm just saying, like, is there a difference?
Of course. Yeah. I actually don't know. The military is really not very present at all in society here, especially in Catalonia. Like, I can't recall ever even seeing military recruitment propaganda or military recruiting offices. I know that they do tend to recruit from other areas more, like what's referred to as like deep Spain, and they also have a pretty high proportion of Latin American immigrants in the military who are using military services as a way to get citizenship. They haven't had so many active engagements that I can think of since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, in which they were tasked with security in a small part of occupied Iraq. So, like, on the one hand, like, they might not be so ideologically prepared for killing civilians, but on the other hand, because probably so few members of the military come from Catalonia, then maybe those cultural divides will be effective, will make it feel like they're not policing their own streets or taking over their own streets. It's I really can't say.
Well, I guess it's just a sit and wait thing, yeah, at this point.
Sit and wait, and also go out in the streets and try to affect the way people are thinking about this. Make plans, be prepared. I mean, any democratic state keeps a pretty big list of internal enemies, and usually nothing much happens to us. We get our rights respected. Every now and then they'll harass a couple of us or arrest a couple of us for something, but for the most part, it feels like everything's safe and bad things don't happen to people simply for having dissident opinions. When a big crisis like this comes and we get warning, and we can see that even if it's not likely, there's a possibility that the military will get sent out. I mean, I think it's important to take advantage of having a little bit of time to prepare. So if in like the worst case scenario, even democratic states are prepared to go up and round up a list of problematic people or internal enemies, then it's nice to have the heads up. So if a possible date like that's approaching, it's relatively easy to not necessarily be in the place where they'd be looking for you. So a lot of these questions of what to expect, of what the different scenarios are really emotionally coded. Like before anything was appearing on the television, no one really would have thought that even this level of conflict was possible. Most people would have, maybe they couldn't have imagined what the exit scenario was, but they wouldn't have thought that actually Spain would go ahead with arresting Catalan politicians. And now people are starting to imagine that maybe even something approaching civil war is possible, or a really heavy crackdown, a temporary suspension of the Catalan government, some kind of dictatorial measure. And so we kind of become conscious of fragility or the instability of the system that we inhabit. That it's just really good usually at projecting stability, projecting this idea of changelessness, and therefore also making us comfortable. But there's really a lot of forms of preparation that people can take, and that they hopefully are taking, instead of just simply waiting. Also in other countries, people out there listening to this, it's good to have a head up. So maybe we can think about like lessons learned from what was effective in terms of international solidarity with other uprisings when there was a big crackdown in the recent years, and start thinking in advance to get a little bit of an advantage. I think probably things won't get too extreme because there's definitely a lot of pressure from the European Union, from investors, from capitalists. At the moment, they don't want to see tanks in the street. They don't want to see people getting shot. But we should never think that if our government's not shooting us, it's because our lives are too valuable to them. I mean, comrades in Yugoslavia, just a month before the civil war there broke out, never happened, and generally nationalism there wasn't even strong. Like, these things can be encouraged pretty rapidly, and sometimes capitalism does need to cause a whole lot of destruction in order to rebuild. And nowadays, that's also not too unlikely a scenario.
Do you have any ideas of specific examples of solidarity that people can work towards getting ready to provide if necessary, if the situation changes or escalates further?
Let's see. Sticks to like arresting Catalan politicians, then I wouldn't worry about it. But if honestly, if major clashes break out, if the Spanish state responds in a way that they're showing contempt for the lives of people here taken to the street, then being aware of Spanish consulates and businesses where protests can be held. Tech folks who, for example, I don't know about in the US, but I know that tech folks on this side of the Mediterranean, tech folks in Europe, did a lot to help comrades in Egypt reconnect to the internet when it got shut off. So if that happens, if that's one of the measures that the Spanish government uses, then people who understand how that works wouldn't hurt. That would be a big help for sure. And just to keep talking, to keep spreading examples of what democracy actually means. So on the one hand, people aren't fooled by these really cheap campaigns for giving false solutions to the problems that folks are facing all over the world. And on the other hand, no one's going to fall into these narratives of nationalism that the Spanish state is using to justify its repression, to motivate people to support repression here. It's also worth saying that it's like whatever popular movement is emerging here, it doesn't stop at the borders. There have been a whole lot of solidarity protests already throughout the Spanish state. Independence movements in Galicia and the Basque Country have been getting stronger. And on the other hand, fascists have been mobilizing. The other day, 800 neo-Nazis and fascists surrounded a government building in Zaragoza, where some politicians, like left-wing politicians who were pro-independence, were speaking. So, not terribly. I don't think it's tragic if Nazis are fighting politicians, but as we well know, like they mobilize, and whatever strength they gain, they use it to go after more vulnerable targets. They'll be attacking us one day. Yeah, it's complicated. Like certainly, I don't want to speak in solidarity with politicians, but at this point, it's really a popular phenomenon. It's like a sort of mass phenomenon that's happening here, and so there's a lot of people who will be facing consequences in the streets.
Are there any specific examples of imaginative approaches towards engaging the situation by Catalan or Spanish, generally, anarchists that you've seen that would be, inspirational to share? I mean, because you said those conversations, like going out and having those conversations, like preparing definitely for possible repression is important. Preparing to be street medics in case the Guardia attacks liberals in the streets, and like offering solidarity to the people that are being attacked by police. But I wonder if there's, because of how complex this is in a lot of people's heads, I'm just wondering if anything stands out as being like, I wouldn't have thought of that. That's really interesting approach.
Yeah. Really the most inspiring thing that's happened so far, that for me anyways, that I've seen, has been what the longshoremen and the port workers have been doing against the boats with the Guardia Civil. But then that just kind of happens to be like a pretty common situation where like that's like a pretty privileged sector of the working class, privileged in the sense of having access to things that actually make a difference, which most of us don't have access to. Most of us can't do what they do. So it's not very surprising that they can pull off a form of resistance that's more inspiring. One thing that's really, really noteworthy is most people in the streets are extremely, extremely enthusiastic about it. And so any criticism of the referendum process will be very difficult to get across, because because things are polarized, they'll automatically associate any criticism of the referendum process with a position in favor of the Spanish state, in favor of the historical oppression of the Catalan culture and language. I mean, it was largely prohibited, for example, during the fascist regime. Those things are important. If anarchists in the past had never been sympathetic to certain aspects of national liberation, aspects which I think should be important to anarchists, obviously not any interclass kind of alliance, obviously not any support for creating a new state, but support for self-organization of human communities, which also includes linguistic and cultural elements. If none of us had been supporting those struggles in any way in the past, then if all of a sudden we just appear in the streets now when there's a possible rupture, then people will very easily see us as just opportunists with actually nothing to say. And in the past few years, I mean, there's been some anarchist presence, but definitely not that much. And in part, that's also because of the left. I mean, the left they've been interested more in hegemonic politics and not in entering any real debates, not in receiving criticisms. So overall, the independence left has been really vital in creating this sort of segregation or separation between views, which has made it harder to be critical participants in some kind of movement around that. And now we're definitely facing those limitations. And anarchists have been in the streets without a doubt, but it's just like this overwhelming mass psychology is really hard to deal with, and also really, really dangerous. I mean, if they win independence due to an act of popular disobedience and popular participation, then they'll create a state which is much stronger than the Spanish state, which is suffering a huge crisis of democracy. Now you'll have a state in which, at least in the beginning, there is no crisis of democracy. There's a great deal of loyalty, and there's a reduced list of who the public enemies would be, and a greater ability of the state to repress those public enemies, repress anarchists, for example. So if there's fighting in the streets and people see anarchists in the streets going up against the police, going up against the military, if that's an issue, then we'll win more camaraderie, more solidarity, and it might be more difficult for the new state afterwards to repress us. But it's a difficult situation. Some people have been setting up defense committees in some towns that are kind of more usually like a popular front model. Like some anarchists are participating in a lot of maybe farther left groups. But it's a situation that's really hard to defend an anti-authoritarian concept of independence and self-determination without defending elitist, authoritarian, and ultimately nationalist concept of political independence. So no, I can't really speak of anything that inspiring. I can just speak of actually a lot of difficulties that we're having. But some of these difficulties kind of point the way to things that we could have done better in the last few years. And I think this is maybe important to people everywhere. I think 9 times out of 10, when there are ruptures, when there are large social conflicts, they're happening in ways that difficult to see the anarchist position in. They're happening according to dichotomies that favor the state on both sides of the dichotomy. So one thing that speaking personally about like my specific circles and the anarchist movement here, but I think also anarchists in general, we're not very good yet at spinning those social conflicts or intervening in those social conflicts in a way that shows a radical path forward. But of course, it's a very difficult thing to do because how spectacular these conflicts are, how molded by the media they are.
I guess an interesting point of intervention in this scenario, and it maybe feels a little bit different than the way that American anarchists, for instance, engage, is I would imagine that within the Catalan context, there are a lot of people bring their politics to their families, and their families, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like this is the context, for instance, in Greece, from what I've heard of people talking about, like you talk politics with your family may disagree with you, but there's that room for intervention, and especially within a multi-generational struggle against cultural colonization that people recognize, that lays the foundation for this discussion about autonomy and a defense of linguistical and cultural heritage, that at least there is the foundation of an anarchist approach, especially since there is that history, as erased as it was by Franco's regime, of resistance to not only the centralized state based out of Madrid, but also with a vision for something else in the future that was more anarchistic or liberatory.
It's more common to have like stronger family relations here. But I mean, I definitely know friends who are from here who can't talk about politics with their families. And I know people in the States who can and do talk politics with their families, and even transgenerational processes of reaction. So yeah, I wouldn't draw a stark line, but the dynamics that you just described are definitely more common here, without a doubt.
What are some possible outcomes from this escalation that we're seeing right now in Catalonia?
3 broad scenarios, and at this point, it's really hard to say if one's more probable than the others. They might all be equally possible. One is that the referendum and the attempt at independence is defeated, either through lots of arrests, make it logistically impossible to practice the referendum, impossible for people to vote, and maybe even that end up suspending the Catalan parliament so that they can't engage in this unilateral rupture. That could happen with simply just police and bureaucratic levels of repression. That could also see some use of the military, although definitely Spain realizes that the European Union is watching, and that anything like that they do, there's a lot of pressure to keep it minimal. If it's not a long-term solution to the problem, because Spain would either have to illegalize the pro-independence political parties, and then risk a completely different kind of conflict, more like what they were using against the Basque independence movement, but in a context in which there's almost no popular support for those repressive measures. And then the other thing would be that the independence movement simply reemerges. So if that's the scenario, then that will probably end up with the right-wing party, the Popular Party, voted out of power, and then some more left-wing government coming in to Madrid, which leads us to the second scenario, which would be that the referendum or the rupture is temporarily put off long enough for Podemos or some left-wing coalition to get into power in Madrid and make a proposal for a constitutional reform or maybe some kind of limited referendum. That would probably be satisfying to the Catalan bourgeoisie, because if they get more control over Catalunya's finances, then they can reinvest more money in Barcelona, which is a major focus of international capital accumulation. They don't need full independence in order to do that. That scenario would, of course, be a big disappointment for the more hardcore independence elements, and for actually a whole lot of Catalan people who already believe that they're going to get full independence. But the media would support it a whole lot, and Podemos, those left-wing parties, would win a whole lot of power if they were able to do something like that, because they would demonstrate themselves as the responsible, pragmatic politicians who saved the day, who saved Spanish unity while also respecting ethnic plurality or whatever. But that might actually be a long-term solution, because it would divide the independence movement between more pragmatists and more idealists. And of course, the ones who would support that reform would have a lot more resources, a lot more power. And then the third scenario would be that they actually achieve independence. At this point, the referendum is just a symbol. It doesn't even really matter what the vote is, because most Catalan people and the Catalan government have already decided that the rupture has happened. So achieving independence would look like Spanish repressive measures would not be effective enough. Maybe that would be because of European Union pressures to keep them from sending in the military. There would certainly be confrontations, but you would just have this, similar to like a color revolution, how the nonviolent color revolutions were happening, where like a whole society went out in the streets. It provoked a huge crisis of governance. And in the end, the elites decided that repression wasn't worth it, and they would allow a formal change to government, which of course wouldn't affect any of the underlying oppressive structures. So in that case, after a level of conflict which might be really high or it might be relatively low, you would see the formation of a new state, which would remain within the European Union. It would be capitalist, it would be a state, it would maintain prisons, it would keep out immigrants, and so on and so forth. That would be a very, like I mentioned, because of it would have greater possibilities of repression, it would have more popular loyalty, it would be easier to identify and isolate internal enemies like anarchists, and it would take a while before people got disappointed and realized the new state hadn't changed these fundamental issues that are affecting everybody. So those I think are the three scenarios, and at this point it looks like they're all equally likely.
Well, we'll keep an eye open and see where it leads to. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to point to in terms of, like, are there any good English language news sources that anarchists outside of the Catalan and Castilian speaking world could keep up on events at?
At the moment, I don't know of anyone who has time for translating things into English from a radical perspective. So at the moment I can't recommend anything. Sorry.
Well, there's always Google Translate, I guess, or Babelfish. Well, thank you very, 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 very much for taking the time and helping me work this out.
It's really awesome.
And a really awesome, like, really open anytime to hearing about, like, to try to make something like this work, especially if it's a time-sensitive thing. I want to be here to help.
It's really awesome. It's great to have that.
You've been listening to our conversation with an Anglophone anarchist based out of Barcelona in Catalonia. And you can hear more shows like this one at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, where you can find out how to sign up for our podcast and download it on a regular for free, including special items such as this that come out really randomly, but sometimes rather timely.
Malditas elecciones, decimos, si la voz rebelde se domesticó. Malditas elecciones, decimos, quieren el gobierno y nosotros no. Menudos demagogos con sus perros de presa, jugando como siempre al palo y la promesa. Malditos socialistas vendidos al patrón, jugando con nosotros al gato y el ratón. Nos habéis traicionado sin ninguna vergüenza, nos habéis desterrado y matado también. Habrá que echar la cuenta de tantas injusticias, la cuenta de la sangre y de la libertad. La cuenta de la sangre y de la libertad.